Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. We're having a talk today on North Korea. Kim Jong-un has been in charge of North Korea for about 4 years. He came in as a young man, a fairly unknown. We did know he'd been educated overseas, spent some time in Switzerland. He loved basketball. Yet, despite the visits of Dennis Rodman, the US basketball player, there's been no basketball diplomacy to speak of that was akin to the ping-pong diplomacy that preceded the thaw in US-China relations under the Nixon administration. So the question being, what's going on in North Korea? Today we have one of the world's leading authorities on the country, Mr. Robert Carlin. Mr. Carlin is not just an observer of North Korea. He's participated in dozens of meetings over the years with US State Department officials and visited the country on dozens of occasions. In 2013, Mr. Carlin updated Don Oberdorfer's book, The Two Koreas. He is here today to talk about the book and his views on the current situation in North Korea. So can I ask you to again please extend a warm welcome to our speaker today, Mr. Robert Carlin.
Thank you, Peter. I don't like to contradict the introduction, but world-leading authority is kind of overkill. I'll take something a little bit less laudatory. I am very happy to be here again. I was here about 8 years ago, and I think my honorary membership has expired. So I'm hoping that it will get renewed at the end of this. I would say that I see a lot of friends in the audience, but with these lights, I don't see a thing. So I'm hoping there are friendly faces out there. I see Anna right there. What I planned was 25 minutes of presentation and then the rest for Q&A. So I hope you'll understand that with 20 minutes, it's not too much time for me to dig myself into a hole, but should give you enough ammunition to ask questions, and we can explore points where I've skipped over some of the details. My last time here, I described how gloomy things were in terms of our relationships with North Korea. This time, unfortunately, I'm going to have to do the same thing. Things have not gotten any better. The questions about North Korea, as Peter suggested, are many, but in fact, there are more answers, I think, than you might imagine if we ask the right questions. That was my role, in fact, as an analyst for so many years in the US government, to correct the questions that were asked of me by policymakers. Very frequently, I would be asked something, and my answer would be, you don't want to know the answer to that. It's not important. This is what you should be focused on. This is the question you need to ask. And that's our problem with North Korea. I think we ask too many of the wrong questions and get ourselves off track. Good place to start is this wonderful book by Don Oberdorfer, which I had the privilege to update took me a couple of years, 2011 to 2013. Don Oberdorfer was just a dogged researcher. He did incredible research and had unbelievably good access to key figures in the history of the two Koreas, actually, from about 1972 and almost until he died this year. But if his research was so good, and it was, and his writing is actually so beautiful, and it is, the question then is, why update it? Why touch it? Why fiddle with something that is actually so valuable by itself? And the answer very practical, is that his publisher said to him, Don, it's time to update this. The last edition was, he finished in December 2000. So about a decade or more had passed. A lot of things had happened. And so there was a need to try to bring people up to date. I'd known Don for many years. I learned from him. I respected him immensely. And I knew that without question, if I didn't take up the opportunity to participate in this book, I'd always regret it. So when he asked me, Rocky-san, I see you. When he asked me if I would update it, I was tremendously honored and very eager to take up the challenge. It took me about 3 years. I had to cut about 100 pages of his book in order to add more or less 100 of my own. And the reason was the publisher said, you cannot make this book so big that it has to be carried around in a wheelbarrow. So the job of cutting was equally difficult with the job of writing. Don's prose is so well woven together that if you begin to pull at one of the threads, you find that you've disrupted things throughout the text. And so you have to choose very carefully what needs to be removed to make room for the new information. So what happened in the intervening 10 years from when Don finished his writing in 2000 to when we picked up the pen again in 2011? I don't think we should mince any words about what happened. In January 2001, U.S. policy toward North Korea went off the cliff. And it has been in free fall ever since. Up to that point, since about from 1994 through 2000, we had 7 years of, more or less, 7 years of engagement with Pyongyang. And however erratically and imperfectly that was carried out, and there were a lot of problems with what we were attempting to do, the fact is there was progress on numerous issues with the North Koreans, on security issues primarily, that affected the whole of Northeast Asia. This was not just U.S. DPRK. Every country, Japan, South Korea, benefited from that agreement. And it's because the agreed framework was more than just the words on paper. It provided a foundation for many, many other negotiations and progress in many other areas. All of this progress, the baby in the bathwater, was thrown away when the Bush administration came into office. And this had negative long-term consequences for all of the countries, and we are still feeling those consequences today. The result is that the almost quarter century of relations or engagement between the U.S. and North Korea has become so laden with myths and misperceptions that it is virtually impossible for the public or the governments to deal with the issue, deal with the issues with Pyongyang on a pragmatic basis. We've virtually lost our ability to think about North Korea. The book, in effect, is an effort to isolate what the problems are, how we got into those problems, and maybe how we can change our perceptions a little bit in order to think more realistically about what confronts us. The essence of the new edition is both updating Don's previous chapters and writing the new events from 2000. The updating is important because in that 10-year period after he finished his writing, we got quite a bit of new information on events in and around the Korean Peninsula. Some of it, a good deal of it actually, from the Wilson Center's very excellent North Korea International Documentation Project. Anyone who's interested in North Korea must access that site because it contains absolutely invaluable diplomatic correspondence, primarily from East European diplomats in Pyongyang home, with their observations about what was happening in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. You learn so much about what Americans had no idea was going on in North Korea. In addition, I had had some personal experience with some of the events that had taken place in the 70s and the 80s. And so I tried to weave that into Don's narrative because I thought there were some places it was thin and needed filling out. The 3 new chapters begins with what I described as our falling off the cliff, the Bush years. I had thought it was going to be a relatively easy thing to write the final chapters until a couple of days after I returned from doing interviews in Seoul in December 2011, I got a phone call at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and a friend said to me, Kim Jong-il has just died. And of course I was sorry for Kim Jong-il, but I was more sorry for me because I was going to have to write a completely different book now. And I thought, son of a gun, he would do that, wouldn't he? So the focus had to shift, and I had to pare down a lot of things that we had had previously on the book. In the Bush years, the story is primarily about the damage wrought by what I call the 3 horsemen of the apocalypse. That is John Bolton, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld, who came into office convinced and determined to do away with the agreed framework, and yet had no idea what they were going to replace it with. They created a vacuum, and we all know what happens in the case where there's a vacuum. Something bad flows in, and in this case, it was the resurrection of the North Korean nuclear weapons program. In the Obama years, curiously enough, disappointingly enough, there was really not much change in Washington's approach toward North Korea. You've had 2 North Korean nuclear weapons tests during Obama's years and a series of long-range rocket missile tests, such that the North Koreans now are developing an effective delivery system. Obviously, I'd be happy to talk about any of those things in more detail. They're in the book in some detail, so if you buy the book, you can get the full accounting. So where are we today? I've got a few minutes left. Where are we today? Simple. There is a stable North Korea under a young leader who, unless something terrifically untoward happens to him, is going to be in power probably for at least another 30 years, maybe longer. In other words, he's going to outlast 6 or 7 South Korean presidents, and you can decide how many Donald Trumps he'll outlast. There's an improving economy in North Korea. Every visitor who goes there, especially those who have been there many times, comes back with essentially the same report. The place looks better. And it's not just Pyongyang. There's enough evidence to suggest that's that wealth is beginning to flow out of the capital into some of the provincial cities. There is a growing North Korean nuclear arsenal. It's not anymore in the range of 1 to 2 or 2 to 4 or 5 or 6 weapons. There's every reason to believe it's anywhere from 16 to 20, 21, 22. And it's more than conceivable. It's quite likely that they are producing enough fissile material every 6 weeks to produce one more nuclear weapon. In other words, by the end of the Obama administration, they could easily have at least fissile material for 8 more nuclear weapons. So the number could be anywhere from 25 to 35 at that point. That's an arsenal. And they have the means of delivery. With China, the narrative has been that the Chinese have been holding off the North Koreans because, for example, Xi Jinping doesn't like Kim Jong-un, or Xi Jinping doesn't like the North Korean attitude, whatever you want it to be, as if the Chinese are somehow in control of this dynamic. My impression is, and some of you may have a different view, but my impression is that over the last 2 years, the Chinese have been trying actually to repair the relationship, and it's the North Koreans who have been holding them off. It's the North Koreans who have been sort of stalling this process. Well, that gives you a different vision of the thinking in Pyongyang and of the actual dynamics in the area. We always look at North Korea as sort of the weaker party. Frequently, the North Koreans turn that weakness into strength when dealing with larger powers. I know the question of the Moranbang band is going to come up, and the fact that they went home early. We can talk about that if you want to, but later. Okay, why don't other people see things the way I do? Well, I could be wrong. I think about that all the time. A good North Korea analyst has to be intellectually honest. And the fact that you could be wrong has to be, accompanying you all the time. But I also think the problem is that there are problems or preconceptions in how we think about North Korea. The problem is how we see what we see in the North, not what we see. We so filter the information that we have that it always falls out the same way. Our moral filters and our sense of right versus wrong and light versus evil makes us interpret everything we see coming out of North Korea one way. And it denies us the opportunity to look at a range of hypotheses. Therefore, we're surprised when Kim Jong-un doesn't disappear, as people suggested he was going to do. Many observers thought after 1 year he'd be gone. Well, he's starting his 5th year. The North Korean economy is improving. It's not supposed to. Every economist will tell you that it's sick. How many times did we hear North Korea was a failed state? Failed states don't explode nuclear weapons. Failed states don't launch ICBM or satellites into space. We have denied ourselves the opportunity to understand that North Korea, unfortunately, works. It's not a moral judgment. It's simply an observation of a fact. Let me end and open it up to questions by noting that journalists, in my view, seem to have a key on their typewriters or on their computer keyboards. And that key unleashes a set of adjectives that must appear in their article on North Korea. The most isolated, repressive, sometimes technically technologically backward country in the world. I'm surprised they don't say in the galaxy or in the universe sometimes, but in the world. Well, first of all, how would you measure such a thing? And secondly, is it accurate? Is North Korea as isolated as we think it is? If you look at it carefully, I think what you discover is that we, certainly in the United States, are more isolated from North Korea than they are from the rest of the world. They have more contact than we imagine. They have, many of them, have a more realistic understanding of what goes on outside than we do of what goes on inside North Korea. Now, I'm not talking about the farmer in Chagan province. God love the farmer in Chagan province, but he's not influencing policy. We're talking about the people who matter in Pyongyang. We say, well, they don't have connection to the internet, and therefore this is somehow a major deficit in North Korea. As I look out in the audience, I think I can see a lot of people here who remember growing up without the internet. And in fact, human civilization existed for a long time without the internet. The internet is not the metric that we need to use in understanding North Korea. And in fact, if you look at the internet, you might come to the conclusion sometimes that you're better off without it. I mean, there's a lot of garbage out there that you don't really need. So I don't find that a very compelling case. The problem is that in the United States, at least, we isolate ourselves from North Korea. Let me give you a few examples real quickly. When the New York Philharmonic was going to go to perform in North Korea in 2008, there were loud voices in the United States arguing we should not do that. We should not allow the Philharmonic to go. We should not, in the words of the Wall Street Journal, serenade the dictator. Orchestra members of Korean extraction were afraid they were going to be taken prisoner. For heaven's sakes, did we really think that the North Korean government would seize members of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra? What were we thinking? Why would we not allow our orchestra to go to North Korea to play music for the Korean people? What possible downside is there in that? And if you look at the video of that performance and you see Lauren Mizell conducting the orchestra in the Star-Spangled Banner with the American flag on the stage in a performance that is televised to the North Korean audience, plus the very big audience in the hall of senior people, you begin to realize that things like this have an effect. They have an impact. It's just one drop on the stone, perhaps, but it's important. And the people who were at that performance remember it. I've talked to some of them. They remember it, and they were happy that it happened. Well, when Pyongyang wanted to send its orchestra to the United States in a reciprocal gesture, the State Department refused to give them visas. Why would we do that? What are we afraid of? Who's isolated from whom in that case? The Globe Theater wanted to perform Hamlet in North Korea. Amnesty International, of all people, said they shouldn't do that. You shouldn't go because it will just serve the purposes of the North Korean dictator. This is Shakespeare. How can Shakespeare possibly serve the interest of a dictator in North Korea? Well, as it happens, they're not going to go, and it's the fault of the North Koreans. But the idea that we would somehow object to that seems to me to be very telling. Sense of humor. I'll tell you one thing. People don't imagine that the North Koreans would have a sense of humor. I can remember after Kim Jong-il's #2, I hate to say #2 man, but highest ranking general came to Washington in October 2000. And it was a visit. We all worked extremely hard to produce. The North Koreans that came were just exhausted at the end of it. Some of them probably hadn't been abroad, certainly hadn't been in the United States, were tired, were sick, were eating American food, which they didn't really want. So in our last banquet, I was sitting next to a North Korean Army colonel, and we were talking about the possibility of the American president visiting North Korea. And I said to him, you know, if the American president goes, there's going to be a huge advance team that goes. There always is when the president goes. Enormous advance team, and they're going to inspect everything. And they said, huge, you know, how big could it be? And so without thinking, I was so tired, I said to him, does the Incheon landing mean anything to you? And his eyes opened, and he drew back for a second, and then he realized I was joking, and he said, I get your point. Well, to me, this was an insight into these guys, that they're not all rigid, narrow-minded. They understand nuance, and they can take a joke. They joked at the table, the negotiating tables we had as well. They used humor as a way to defuse tension. So the stereotype about them is these rigidly ideological James Bond type villains, unfortunately, is not accurate, and it doesn't help us in conceptualizing how we're going to deal with them. Why don't I stop there? That leaves us about half an hour for questions. We can go back for whatever you want to discuss.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Carlin.
Yeah.
So, any questions from the floor? Yes, Anthony, if you could please introduce yourself and who you're working for.
Anthony Rowley, Singapore Business Times. Just before I ask my question, I think President Putin would agree with much of your analysis, because I remember he gave a press conference many years ago in Okinawa, which I was at, and he'd just come from Pyongyang. And after that, things began to open up. Madeleine Albright went to Pyongyang. A number of countries, including, I think, Ireland and Italy, recognized diplomatically. And then, of course, Bush came to office, President Bush, and spoke of the axis of evil, and then everything fell to pieces. But my question is, you don't subscribe to the collapsist theory of North Korea. So what do you think are the prospects for reunification, especially in the context of the sort of changing international scene, China's rivalry with the United States, and different polarization of views? And secondly, what do you think are the prospects for the economy? I mean, you say that its prosperity is spreading out from Pyongyang and so on. Do you think that the economy is becoming more marketized to the point where it can, integrate more closely with other parts of the region or other parts of the world?
I've never been compared with Putin before. I suppose. Is that good? I hope. Oh, good. Okay, then I'm pleased. Reunification. When I started working on North Korea in 1974, I never imagined that it would still exist today. There seemed no reason to think, certainly by by the late 1980s, when South Korea was so much stronger. The Olympics, 88 Olympics in Seoul, had been attended by the entire Soviet bloc, I think. North Korea was losing ground. South Korea was ascending. It looked as if South Korea should be able to do what West Germany was doing in terms of dominating the situation. Well, here we are, how many years later? North Korea is still there. It's certainly stronger than it was in 1994 when Kim Il-sung died. And I don't see South Korea as really taking control of the situation. In fact, if you look closely, I think you can see signs that South Korea is, be very careful in what you hear me say, because it's not, relative to where South Korea was before, it's declined. in many ways. Its economy is not booming like it was. The population is beginning to shrink. The challenges to the nation are growing. They may well be able to meet all these. I hope so. But the fact is, South Korea is not what it was vis-a-vis North Korea a decade or two ago. And it doesn't seem to be the engine driving events. So I don't think that we're looking at reunification anytime soon, barring some jolt from heaven. That doesn't mean there can't be a knitting together in some sense of some of the vital bloodlines, as the North Koreans like to call it, of the nation. There are some economic, cultural things that can be done. It seems to me under Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, you had progress in those respects. Maybe those can, they can return to those and develop them. But reunification, personally, I just don't, I don't see it anytime soon. Second question, the economy. I'm not an economist. I can only listen to those people who have observed the fact that things seem to be getting better. Even the Daily NK website, which is certainly not pro-North Korean, consistently reports this growing middle class. Many of the things that it reports, which are supposedly derogatory of the regime, actually begin to show you increased marketization. The food situation stabilizing, not great, but stabilizing. Economists that I talk to really don't understand where the money is coming from for this growth in the economy. It's coming from somewhere, some investment or something is coming from somewhere, and it's allowed markets to grow, a middle class to grow, and things like, simple things like traffic in the streets to become, you know, noticeably more numerous. Well, if you got more cars, you have to have more gasoline. You have to have more gasoline, you have to have gas stations. They're just a range of things that we're beginning to see that we never saw before. I don't know anyone who really can explain it, but it keeps moving. And so, as far as I can tell, there's every reason to expect that as long as the regime doesn't get in the way, to continue. I don't think they're going to approach, you know, South Korea's wealth. That's not the point. But within North Korea, things will improve. Integration with the outside, you know, there may be more with China, maybe some with South Korea. Other than that, there isn't much that I see because they have to provide an element of certainty to businessmen, which they don't seem able to do right now. Even though they pass all the laws and everything is on paper, people are still suspicious, and so they just can't move beyond a certain point.
Yeah, just here. Yes.
Siegfried Knittel, writing for the Austrian newspaper, the Standard. Korea specialist some years told me the Obama administration, or Obama, he cannot change North Korean policy because the whole administration in the US is totally against a change in the North Korean policy. Why is this true, and why didn't this change after Democratic President Obama came in office? And I thought he is a very open-minded man. And is it not possible for the administration to have a different thinking?
Great question. I really seriously wish I knew. The part of the answer is this is not a partisan issue. This is an American problem. As a culture, we have a hard time dealing with a country like North Korea. It is so easy for our moral sensibilities to overwhelm pragmatic considerations. We stereotype the place. We demonize the leadership. If you look at American journalists, sorry, Anna, by and large, the public discussion of North Korea in the United States, pretty much in Japan as well, is thin, stereotyped, sensational, not serious. The people they talk to, there aren't many people who understand North Korea. The people they talk to don't know what they're talking about. And so you get this echo chamber where you get these adjectives repeated over and over again. Everybody begins to believe them. And there's no realistic assessment of what is going on there. Even when people are confronted with facts that go contrary to what they think, they have an easy time pushing them aside. That's what happened in the Obama administration. Let's put it another way. The Clinton administration was extremely unusual. There was, I don't know how to describe it. It was sort of a God-given opportunity when the president himself became committed. The people he appointed understood what their job was and effectively organized things to accomplish that. Even so, after the agreed framework, 1994, was finished, it began to lose steam in the administration because the administration sort of lost its focus and its commitment, and things started falling apart piece by, it was like being in an airplane and pieces were falling off. If it hadn't been for Bill Perry in 1999, who did a wonderful, honest, thorough review of the policy, we might not have pulled out of the dive, but we did. And so the final 2 years of Clinton produced astounding progress with the North Koreans. And the tragedy is that it couldn't be sustained.
This lady here.
Thank you. Anna Fifield from the Washington Post, American newspaper. Bob, thank you very much. It was very entertaining, as always. So I have two questions just to follow on from the last one, basically. So what do you think would be the chances of the Obama administration suddenly now in the last year having a gust of energy or a change of heart or whatever and trying to do something on North Korea to make progress in some way? And then secondly, obviously we don't know who is going to be the next president of the US, but regardless of who it is, what do you think are the prospects for progress in the next administration? I.e., are the North Koreans now just holding their breath and waiting to see what happens and rearing to go in 2009? Thank you.
Right. You know, I think you sort of pinpointed a major problem that we have helped to create. That is, I think, a conclusion the North Koreans have reached at the highest levels is that the United States cannot sustain a policy over administrations. And that therefore, even if they were to reach important agreements with the Obama administration, agreements in which they effectively had to make compromises that weaken their own national security in hopes of positive responses from the Americans. Even if they did that, the new president probably couldn't sustain it. And therefore, they probably shouldn't do it. They should lower the bar for what they want to accomplish with the Americans. I think that's a terrible lesson for them to have learned. And I wish there were a way of convincing them that it isn't so. The problem is the past 15 years have suggested it is so, and that what they're doing is an entirely rational response to a reality that they see from the United States. What that means is, you've got to remember that the push for engagement with the United States from whenever it was, 92, actually came from a strategic decision that Kim Il-sung made around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was his estimation that Russia, certainly under Boris Yeltsin, and China under Deng Xiaoping were potential threats to the DPRK. And that, therefore, the DPRK needed to reach out to another major power which could effectively provide a buffer. And that was the United States. On this, most of what I think about North Korea is sort of based on surmise and experience. On this, we had extremely good information about this decision. And we saw it play out. And so what Kim Jong-il was doing was, in effect, following through on a major central decision by the regime to engage the Americans because it was in North Korea's vital national security interest to do so. After the Bush administration came in, I think it was a rude shock to the North Koreans. Certainly the Kelly visit of October 2002 was a huge shock to them. And they began to recalculate whether or not engagement with the Americans was actually going to do for them what they thought it was. By the time Kim Jong-un came in, I suspect that they've discarded that. And that is no longer the engine driving their policy, and that's one of our problems. It's harder for us to figure out at what level they're really going to engage us and what the impetus behind that is going to be. We may have lost a golden opportunity, in other words, and we have to find ways to create another one. Patrick, it's your job.
Yes.
Süddeutsche Zeitung, Germany, Neidhardt. There's this theory, I think, brought forward by Jang Jin-sung first, that Kim Jong-un is only a figurehead. What do you make of that? And if I may follow up, how do you assess South Korea's and Park Geun-hye's North Korea policy?
Figurehead. Well, of course, when you work with North Korea as an analyst, you always put in front of yourself a series of working hypotheses. And as information comes in, you adjust them, or you discard one of them because it's clearly not working anymore. So the figurehead hypothesis was something to consider at the beginning, certainly. Less and less do I think it is credible. I can't discard it completely because I really don't know. But this regime is beginning to act like, very, very much like the previous regimes. That is, one man is in charge. Now, if you want to argue with me, it's not Kim Jong-un, it's somebody else, I couldn't counter that. But neither of us could prove the point, I don't think. So I wouldn't know what to do with it. South Korean policy, in what regard? Towards North Korea? I have to be careful because I understand that the South Koreans have a suit against a Sankei Shimbun guy for slander, so I think she's a fine leader. But I think her policy toward North Korea has been wrong-footed. I don't think she has I don't think she understands the strong points of the policies that preceded hers. I don't mean Lee Myung-bak. I think his reign was a complete waste of time. And since he's not in power, I can't be sued for slander. But in fact, people may not like the sunshine policy of Kim Dae-jung. That's fine. There are a lot of things to object to. But the fact is, if you look at it within certain parameters, it was effective. Same with Nomuhyan. And if you read Lim Dong-Wan's memoirs, Lim Dong-Wan was head of national security in South Korea under DJ. He had just countless meetings with the North Koreans. He understood them extremely well. He had a lot of personal stories to explain how it was you could deal with them. She should be learning from him, it seems to me, because those lessons would stand her in good stead with engaging the North Koreans. She won't do that for some reason. She's opposed to that sort of approach to the North Koreans. And as a consequence, I believe she's wasted the first 3 years of her administration. Consequently, she doesn't have much time left. And the North Koreans know it. And the North Koreans also think they know that in the last year or so of every South Korean president's administration, going back 30 years or more, that South Korean president says, oops, I need a legacy in the hurry. And the best legacy I can get is progress with North Korea. Therefore, they're willing to make compromises, the North Koreans think. Therefore, they'll wait another year. They can wait. And she hasn't done anything to push, really intelligently, to push them beyond that, I don't think. But she's a good leader. I repeat. Yeah.
Joël?
Legendre at TV5 RTL. What could work with Iran that couldn't work with Kido? What were the main problems in the fact that Kido had to disappear, to your knowledge, as you've been working on that?
Oh, good. Great. I'm glad. 2 words. John Bolton. Seriously. Kido was very complicated. It was a very steep learning experience how to put together 4 different bureaucracies, financial wheels that were turning at the same time, technical wheels that requirements and engineering requirements, doing all of this in a very difficult environment in North Korea. It was tough, but the fact is, by 2001, Kido was making very significant progress, significant enough that Kim Jong-il recognized it and we understood, praised it. The problem was, when the Bush administration came in, they were determined to destroy Kido. And John Bolton made it clear that the administration was going to stop funding Kido. They were going to give them funds for 1 more year or so, and then that was it. There were going to be no more funds. Without American leadership, Kido could not succeed. And therefore, it bled to death. I came into Kido in 2002, just as it was simultaneously sort of peaking in its progress on the ground and losing altitude because of the political realities in Washington. We went through 4 years of hell trying to keep Kido alive, not because building light water reactors in North Korea was the be-all and end-all of policy, but because it was an organization that had credibility with North Korea. Whatever North Korea's relations were with each individual country, it could pretend as if Kido somehow superseded them. And therefore, its own relations with Kido could be better than those with any one country at any one time. We thought that that provided a very important platform for the different governments to utilize when they were having sort of problems of their own dealing with North Korea. Washington did not want to hear that. Japan, after a certain point, became savage in its opposition to Kido, and the South Koreans hung on as long as they could and then decided it was hopeless, abandoned us in a lurch. And so the thing sank. And interestingly enough, the North Koreans continued to abide by a series of very complex legal agreements with Quito up until the end. You hear all the time, oh, the North Koreans violate every agreement they've ever signed. Well, they didn't violate those Quito agreements. And they had to do with the safety of South Korean personnel, 1,000 of them, in North Korea. The North Koreans could easily have violated those or discarded them at some point because, as they said, you're not building light water reactors on our territory anymore. Essentially, all you're doing is occupying our land. But they said, we'll continue to abide by these agreements essentially until the end. And so that's what they did.
Anthony, another question?
Just following up on something you said earlier, you said that investment is going into North Korea, but you're not sure where it's coming from. Well, it's not coming from the United States, I don't think, and it's not coming from Japan. And I don't think it's coming from Russia, so it must be coming from China, isn't it, to the extent that it is external investment? Or is it internally generated investment?
I probably, an economist would probably have my head. I probably shouldn't have used the word investment. Money is somehow being created and circulating in North Korea in a way which allows an expansion of the economy. Whether that is investment from the outside or not, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. But it is clear that once you get money moving, we hear this all the time in terms of, you know, the American economy. Once you get money moving, it multiplies, right, itself. I earn money, I spend money here. Look, when people in North Korea can own their own real estate, which we never understood before, but is so, they own their own real estate, which means they hire workmen to renovate the apartment. So there's money moving, changing hands. Then those workmen, you know, need to take a taxi to work. So there's more money. There are more taxis on the streets in North Korea, apparently, than ever before. And regular North Koreans are taking the taxis. Who runs the taxi companies? Who's making that risk? You know, where do they get the gasoline? Well, we hear, well, it's corruption. Well, okay, it's corruption. The fact is there are more taxis on the street. More North Koreans are using them. There's more mobility. So there's more life in the cities, and that means the economies are getting better. And yes, some of that is coming from China. It's pretty clear. But is that the totality of it or not? I don't know. If there are economists here, maybe they can explain it.
Yes, Siegfried?
What we every time heard is on Kim Jong-il, the economy was in a bad condition, bad shape more. Now it looks like it's better now. Is there a difference in the economy policy of the former Kim Jong-il administration and the Kim Jong-un administration? Is Kim Jong-un a better economist?
In 2002, Kim Jong-il launched a series of new economic policies. People don't like to call them reforms, but that's sort of what they were. New economic policies which sort of contain the seeds of what's happening now. Effectively, the effort was to wean the people away from total reliance on the state, so that they didn't have to make choices. The state was supplying everything. It was subsidizing everything. And the economists were telling Kim Jong-il, this is not effective. It means that nobody feels like they have to work hard. So what they began to do was pull away some of the subsidies, raise salaries, but also raise prices, so people had to make choices. That lasted 2-3 years. It worked pretty well, and then for a variety of reasons, the regime pulled back. Kim Jong-un, I believe, is picking up on that. that was almost resurrected at the end of Kim Jong-il's reign. Some of these things started to kick back in again. As he was preparing the succession for his son, they thought that succession process was going to last longer, and therefore they would have more time to create good economic circumstances, so when Kim Jong-un took over, he'd be in better position than his father was when he took over. Well, the grooming process didn't last that long. Kim Jong-il died way before expected. And so what Kim Jong-un did was pick up and has sustained now for 4 or 5 years those policy lines. It's interesting that in his first address to the people in April 2012, Kim Jong-un included in his speech a very important line about the people no longer having to tighten their belts. This was a critical image in North Korean propaganda for years, and it was meant to explain why people lived so poorly, because they had to sacrifice now for the military strength and the benefit of the regime, so that once reunification came, everything would be good for everybody. Well, they endured this belt tightening for decades. And Kim Jong-un comes in and says publicly, you're not going to have to tighten your belts anymore. This had a big impact. And it created a debate within the regime. So that in 2013, Kim Jong-un announced a slightly new policy, his Byungjin policy, not brand new, but relatively new, in which he said they were going to pursue both nuclear weapons and the economy at the same time. That, in effect, was pulling back a little bit from the belt tightening thing, but not completely. He didn't want to give that up. That's where we are today. He is continuing to emphasize, if you look at his appearances, they're overwhelmingly to economic sites and to economic projects, and less so to the military. That's by design. That's what he's trying to emphasize. I don't know if he's a better economist, but he seems to have a better sense of what he has to accomplish in order to strengthen his rule.
Okay, there's time for one more question. Greg?
Gregory Clark, freelancer from Australia. I appreciated your talk very much, particularly the damage done by the Bush years. I was involved in the ping-pong diplomacy with China. And in fact, I had to organize a whole ping-pong team from Australia because the Australian government was opposed to it. We had our Bushes in Australia as well.
Right.
A key reason why ping-pong diplomacy worked so well was that when we got there, we were given complete freedom to travel around the country, see what we wanted to see, talk to what we wanted to do. Now, one of the things that really does damage to the North Korean image is that every time somebody goes there, you know, they go to the same sites, same stories repeated time and time again. Right. Are there any people there who realize the negative effect that has on their image generally, and how it allows the hawks to justify their anti-North Korea position? Are there some people more liberally minded there in North Korea?
The answer is, I think the answer is yes. I've certainly talked to some of them. When you explain to them exactly what you said, they sigh and look to the heavens and shrug their shoulders. They know how ineffective it is. They know that when they have a major holiday and they invite the foreign press in and then they hold them on tight leashes, it doesn't do any good. It's counterproductive. So yes, they know. In large part, this is controlled both by probably the Ministry of State Security, which is very tough, and the Propaganda and Agitation Department, which also is fairly narrow in its approach. So trying to get these more broad-minded thoughts through these pinholes in the regime is not easy to do. There were two exceptions to this. When Madeleine Albright went to Pyongyang, we saw total cooperation from the part of the North Koreans. It was like night and day. I can remember sitting in the guest house, and one of the Americans came up to the North Korean scheduler and said, I know it says in the schedule, you know, thus and such, but we needed a car. This was like at 11 o'clock at night, but we needed a car going somewhere else. And I knew what the answer was going to be, which was, oh, well, I don't know, very difficult. I'll have to check. Oh, it can't be. The answer instead was, okay, sure. Fine, get your car. Holy crow. Well, the reason was the order came down from on high. Same thing with the New York Philharmonic. They got incredible cooperation. Anything the New York Philharmonic wanted, it got immediately. Same thing. So it would take Kim Jong-un's order to people to say, I don't want any more garbage. You know, when this group comes, you just let them roam around. Not impossible, but probably at this point pretty difficult to do. And so they're going to keep pulling against themselves. They're working against themselves. You're right. Yeah.
Could you take one more question? Or?
Sure.
Yeah?
Of course.
A question about the Oberdorfer book. For your updating, you actually asked the North Koreans to give you some input or to give you interviews, and you never got an invitation, I think. Right. Have you ever had any reaction after it was got published?
To the book? I gave the book to the North Korean ambassador in New York, presented him a copy. And I said to him, Mr. Ambassador, if there's anything in this book that they don't like in Pyongyang, don't blame me. Your people wouldn't agree, you know, to the interviews. And he smiled because I think he understood exactly what the problem was. I think there were North Koreans who would have entertained more involvement in this, but it was just too difficult. How do you explain to your superiors that, well, I want to, for the first time, sit down with an American author to talk about potentially sensitive issues, you know, which almost certainly the Americans will bend and distort, which is what happens all the time in newspaper articles. No, on second thought, I better not raise this because I'm only going to get criticized. So it's one of those things where you'd think it would be easy to do, especially because, I mean, they've worked with me for decades. They know who I am. They know I'm not out to undermine them, and that it was a strictly academic exercise, but they couldn't do it. And that's another one of these instances where they work against themselves. Yeah. I don't think they've bought a lot of copies.
Okay, we have run out of time there. So my last job today is to give you your new honorary membership of the club. And thank you very much for your speech today. Thank you. Can we have a last round of applause, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.